Hi, and welcome to Math for All. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the following topics. We'll be looking at finding the zeros of a quadratic relation. And of course, whenever we're talking about zeros in a quadratic relation, we're talking about our x-intercepts. We'll also be looking at finding the maximum or a minimum value of a quadratic relation. And whenever we're talking about a maximum or a minimum value, we're really talking about the vertex of a parabola. Okay, we're going to look at the following example. We have x squared minus 11x plus 10. And the question is, what are the zeros of this relation? And so our biggest question is, if we have this relationship, essentially what the question is asking us, well, if we have a parabola, where will the parabola cross our x-axis? And so in this case, we can see that if x squared is positive, our parabola is actually going to be facing up. And so it should cross our x-axis in two places, because we know that this is an expression that can be factored. And so to find these zeros, essentially we just need to factor out the equation. In order to do that, we write our numbers as we've done in the past. And so our first number only gives us the numbers 1 and 1. And then we are looking at the last number. What are the multiples in order to get 10? Well, 1 times 10 gives us 10, 2 and 5, and then we have 5 and 2, or also 10 and 1. We have no other options. And so because this is a 1 and 1, we don't really have to repeat our numbers after that. It usually is helpful when there is a number in front of x squared, but those are more complicated types of factoring questions. Okay, so what are the numbers that we can multiply together that when we add or subtract, we get number 11? And the answer is those two numbers, number 1 and the number 10. And so we're going to have these two numbers in our first bracket and these two numbers in our second bracket. Instead of the number 1, we're going to write in x. So here are our brackets. We're going to write x, the number 1, instead of number 1, x again, and the number 10. And once again, at the very end, we have to figure out what are the signs. Do we put a plus? Do we put a minus? And so these two signs will play that role. In order for us to get a plus sign at the end, we can either multiply a positive number by a positive number. However, because this number is negative, we have to multiply two negative numbers together instead. And it makes sense because once we add two numbers together, we should really get a negative 11. So we should have a negative 1 and a negative 10. Once they're added together, we get that number in between. And so once we have this, it's not over. What we need to do is we need to look at every single bracket in this expression. So we're going to look at our first one first. Because we're looking at the point where our parabola crosses the x-axis, the value of y is 0. So essentially we're saying that 0 is equal to one of these brackets. So let's say is this expression. When x minus 1, when we have 0 is equal to x minus 1. The question is, what is the value of x? Well, the negative 1 can be brought over an equal sign. What minus 1 equals 0? And the answer is 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. So that's our first value of x. For a second bracket, we have x minus 10. So the question is, what minus 10 is 0? And of course, logically, we should be able to figure out that the answer is 10. And so mathematically, anytime a number crosses an equal sign, its sign changes. If it was negative, it becomes positive. If it was positive, it becomes negative. In this case, x is going to be equal to 10. So we have two values for x. The parabola I have is unfortunately incorrect. It should actually be shifted, and so I'm going to erase this parabola, and I'm going to make sure that it matches what we have here. And so our parabola should cross our x-axis at 1. So we're going to do it over here. And it's going to cross our x-axis at somewhere over here. I'm just going to call it 1 and 10. And it will do something like this instead. So this is a very rough sketch of the parabola. And that's all we have to do in order to find our zeros. I'm sorry I had to erase the board. It's just that if I had a bigger board, if people could subscribe and like, I'll be able to afford a bigger board. But in this case, let's go with what I have. And so continue on with the same question. Now we have a very minimal drawing of the parabola. What we do want to know are the following two things. We need to know what the y-intercept is, and preferably it would be nice if we got to know what the value of the location of the vertex is also. And so in order to find the location of the vertex, we need to know where the axes of symmetry actually fall. And they will always fall in between our two zeros. And so we always have to look at the gap between these two numbers. In this case, our gap is 9, right? The gap between 1 and 10 is 9. So all we have to do now is, if we take this number, if we divide it by 2, we're going to get 4.5. This is one way of doing it. Now we can take this value and we can either subtract it from the bigger number, or we could add it to the smaller number. Sometimes it's easier to add than to subtract. And so we're going to go with the number 1. 1 plus 4.5 gives us a horizontal position of 5.5. And so in this case, when x is equal to 5.5, the question is, what's the value of y? So we have to go back to our original equation, and we can plug in 5.5 into that equation. We did have the same equation in its factored form, so it was x plus 1 and we had two negatives, x minus 1 and x minus 10. And so we can actually plug 5.5 into both of these equations. Okay, we're going to get the same answer. In fact, all we're doing is we're multiplying this number, we're multiplying negative 4.5, and we're multiplying positive 4.5. So we can just take this and essentially just multiply it with a negative and a positive. Or you can take the longer route and you can plug this number in. 5.5 minus 1 gives us negative 4.5. Whoops. So you have to be careful with the signs. I always said that whenever you're dealing with positive or negative signs, you have to be very vigilant. So 5.5 minus 1 is positive 4.5. And 5.5 minus 10 gives us negative 4.5. When you multiply these two numbers together, what do we get? It's 20.25. So we have 20 and a quarter. So essentially, the location of our vertex is when x is 5.5, our y value is negative 20.25. Okay, just keep in mind that the first value is our x and then our y coordinate. Okay, lastly, we still have to find our y-intercept. In order to find the y-intercept, we have to keep in mind that our x value is 0. All we have to do now is we can either do it with our original equation, which is easier, or we can use our factored form. We'll still get the same answer. And we'll do it, in this case, why don't we do it in both cases? If you plug in 0 for x, it will be 0 minus 0 plus 10. Very simple. So in this case, our y-intercept happens to be 10. If we do it here, 0 minus 1 is negative 1, and negative 1 times 0 minus 10, which is negative 10, we'll get a positive value. So negative times negative will give us a positive value of 10, and we still get the same answer. Okay, so the last thing we need to keep in mind is, what do we mean when we're talking about a maximum and minimum of a parabola? So we have two very similar equations in this case. We have y equals positive x squared and y equals negative x squared. Whenever the value of x squared is positive, we can always say that the parabola faces upwards. And so this would be its lowest position, and this would be known as its minimum. If you have a negative sign in front of x squared, it doesn't really matter what number you plug in for x, whether it's positive or negative, our answer will always be negative. Let me show you what I mean by that. If you plug in negative 1 for x, squared means you multiply this number by itself. However, there's a negative in front of x squared. This negative really tells us that whatever you were multiplying or squaring, that negative impacts your answer after. And so in this case, negative 1 times negative 1 gives us an answer of positive 1, but that negative will make your answer negative. So it doesn't really matter what your values are, whether it's negative 1 or negative 10, your answer will always end up being negative. And in that case, the parabola will actually flip this way. And so it will face downwards, and this will represent its maximal value.